Welcome to the Dark Stream, Vox Day, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. I'm told that the audio is good, video is good, DLive chat is up, unauthorized chat is up, and super chats are active. So, anyhow, I'm not going to allow myself to be distracted by the discussion about who the funniest author of all time is. We can address that some other time if you're interested. But as you know, I am in the final stages of finishing up the first draft of A Sea of Skulls. I expect to send it off to the readers by the end of this month. I'm very close. It's like 10,000 words away, which for me is not very much. And one of the things that people have said, there's not that much in the way of real epic fantasy out there. And there's a good reason for that. It's difficult to write. It is far more difficult to write a novel than it is a short story. And it's even more difficult to write a epic size novel than it is to write a regular novel. One thing that I've learned is that writing one 900-page novel is very different than it's not just writing three 300-page novels. That's part of the reason why it takes so long sometimes. There's so many things to go wrong, so many things to keep straight, etc., etc. But, people, when Throne of Bones first came out, people compared it to a Game of Thrones. As the inadequacies of George Martin and his writing became more and more apparent over time, and Dance with Dragons came out, The Winds of Winter, or whatever it's called, didn't. But one of the unexpected consequences of a Game of Thrones, the television show, was the inadequacies of Martin as a storyteller. He's not a bad storyteller by any stretch of the imagination, but he is fundamentally a TV storyteller. In the same way that I'm not a true writer because I'm a game designer at heart, George R.R. Martin is not a true writer because he's a TV guy at heart. He wants to write scripts. Even when he's writing books, he's writing scripts. In the same way that even when I'm writing books, I'm writing games, right? So, it's been interesting to see how the comparison of the Selenoth books, The Arts of Dark and Light, have been compared to the changing way it's been compared to A Song of Ice and Fire and The Lord of the Rings. It's been very interesting because when The Throne of Bones first came out, there was absolutely with very, very few exceptions, virtually no one thought that it was as good as Martin's stuff. You can read the early reviews and people were comparing it to Martin. What's been interesting is that after A Sea of Skulls came out, after more people went back and read Sum Helvetica, and after the Martin came out with more stuff, the general tone of people who actually read both books, again, your average science fiction and fantasy community would absolutely disagree with the community that's read both the different, or all three of the different books. But generally, the way that people look at it now is that Tolkien stuff is the best, mine comes in after that, and Martin comes up third. Fine, whatever. It is what it is. It makes no difference, right? My opinion, your opinion is irrelevant. What matters is what people think 20, 30 years from now. Fencing Bear says, limited as I am here, I will try to say what makes Selenoth strong is its theological grounding. That may be, but I see most of the people that I would consider to be Selenoth fans tend to disagree with that. Um, the Idaho Crusader says, I think the world you've created is more interesting than Lord of the Rings, but I like Roman stuff and elves not being necessarily good. Um, Maybe I tend to disagree, but the biggest thing, and the one area where I do tend to agree with my fans, um, you know, it was kind of funny. I actually felt kind of insulted once. Not kind of. I actually felt insulted by Space Bunny once, even when I agreed with her, because I had mentioned that people were comparing it to Lord of the Rings, and I said, and even in some cases favorably, and her reaction was basically, she's like, that's because you're your fans. I'm like, well, you're my wife and you don't think so. So anyhow, um, but I just thought it was really the rolling of the eyes and the that, that was like, now hang on now. I mean, I agree it's not as good. Absolutely, 100%. But I think it at least bears a comparison before you decide against it. You know what I mean? Anyhow, um, it's never been my goal in any way, shape, or form. I feel very flattered that anybody finds any room to compare it at all, right? But I asked one of the people that had said this. I said, "Well, how on earth can you possibly compare my epic fantasy to Tolkien's?" I'm like, that literally favorably. I mean, that literally sounds crazy to me. And I'm not being modest here. Yes, I am a huge Tolkien fan, but I'm a fan of other writers that, frankly, I think some of my books are better than. You know, um, there's plenty of nonfiction writers that I don't think have written anything as perspicacious as either SJWs Always Lie um, or Corporate Cancer, or even The Irrational Atheist. Doesn't lessen my regard for them at all. It just means I'm confident in my own stuff. But I was a little surprised when the person came back and they said, "I like military fiction, and your understanding of how the the battles work is just your descriptions of them are much better than Tolkien's." Which is a little bit odd when you think about the fact that he went through the hell of World War One, and you know the closest I've ever come to war was you know martial arts dojos. So, but I did have one advantage over him in that, having studied at the feet of William S. Lynn, Martin Van Creveld, and Jerry Pournelle, not to mention you know, Commandant Krulak and the Marines Marine, I did learn a lot about the more technical aspects of it. And so, uh, and this was exacerbated, the situation was exacerbated by the movies. Now, what's interesting is that for all their flaws, when they first came out, I was so excited by the movies. I thought they were so great. I went to the first two. Um, I went to the first two movies um, on the opening night, and it was fantastic. Um, the third one, we actually not only went on, I think we went on the second night, but we watched the entire first two movies first, and then went the next day. So, anyhow, Space Bunny was, she's the in-house critic. Space Bunny was the one who pointed out, she said, she didn't think it was that great. She didn't think it was particularly good. And what I realized is that she was right, that what Jackson got right was he got the look and feel right. He presented, you had a sense of actually being in Middle-earth. But what they got wrong, of course, was the dialogue and the way that they attempted to bring to life the situations that Tolkien, probably more or less wisely, avoided addressing directly. So anyhow, we were watching part of the Two Towers tonight. There's certain movies where if Space Bunny's flicking the channel, you just end up staying there for a while. And I caught something that I hadn't caught before, and it just made me laugh about the just general ineptitude of Hollywood attempting to present military situations, especially when they were basing them on on a work by an author who didn't do a particularly good job of it. So let's have a look here, and I'm going to show you first the obvious one. This is the scene that always bugged me. This is the scene that always bothered me, even the moment that I first saw it in the movie. This is a section they call the Sacrifice of Faramir. So we'll watch it first, and then we'll talk about it a bit, and then I'll go over I'll point out exactly what we're seeing, the problems.
Faramir! Faramir! Your father's will has turned to madness. Do not throw away your life so rashly.
Where does my allegiance lie if not here? This is the city of the men of Númenor. I will gladly give my life to defend her beauty, her memory, her wisdom.
Your father loves you, Faramir. You will remember it before the end.
Can you sing, Master Hobbit?
the edge of night until the stars are all alight. Mist and shadow, cloud and shade, all shall fade, all shall fade.
Okay, I can't take anymore. It's just the retardery is too great. Now, understood that the movie writers, the script writers, tried to cover this. They tried to cover themselves and say, well, you know, they know it's a suicide charge, dun 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 dun, all this sort of thing. But what are they charging? What is the charge? What is there's nobody in the history of cavalry has ever ridden their cavalry against an actual fortified position. Okay? I mean, it was, I don't even, I mean, it really threw me out of the movie even the first time I saw it, because, you know, if we pop this up here, okay, so I will turn off the sound and we'll find the bit. So let's find that, what they're charging towards here, okay? So what is it they're charging towards? Actually, hang on, let me turn the mute. Okay, so they're walking here towards what? You know, okay, look at that. Look at what they're charging, what they're supposedly charging towards. It's a freaking build. It's a series of buildings. How are you supposed to ride a horse up there? I mean, forget the archers. Even if there weren't archers there, even if the position wasn't even held, you can't ride horses up there. You know, and I think that's why they had to really overdo the music, and they had to overdo, you know, the sadness as they're riding out. I mean, the funny thing is, they have a lot more force riding out than the charge of the Rohirrim from inside Helm's Deep. You know, where's all the sad music and the flowers and the sad faces? Also, you know, I mean, cavalry forces, if you've read the History of Peninsular War, cavalry forces are incredibly independent. You know, Cactus Eater Bear says, as a bear, I can sincerely say that I would ride up and not think about it. Okay, that's just that's just frightening. It says, no architecture has ever withstood a charge of heavy horse. Pretty sure that's from Braveheart. Yeah, I mean, it's bad enough, you know, the charge at the very end, Eomer's charge at Helm's Deep. You know, I hated that one too, just because horses don't charge pikes. Now, they did do the blinding blast of light. You know, fair enough. Venomous says, in their defense, being that retarded is fairly sad. But here's the thing. No cavalry is going to obey that kind of order. Okay? Even in, if you look at the history of Napoleonic battles, one of the more impressive feats during the Napoleonic Wars was accomplished by a British regiment that managed to go more than 2 miles while being constantly assaulted by cavalry without losing a single man. And let's see here. Oh, we have a super chat from Sam Freeman. He says, "There's not to reason why. There is but to do and die. Light Brigade, bravado, stupidity." Yes and no. I mean, that's obviously what Faramir's charge is supposed to be a callback to. But the Light Brigade had a chance. Like, the Light Brigade could have succeeded. Cavalry was used to destroy artillery all the time. Just because it didn't work didn't mean that it was impossible. Didn't mean that it couldn't be done. If I recall correctly, the Light Brigade was charging Russian artillery, and they, just suffered tremendous casualties. They barely got there, and then they got driven back. I mean, that's a famous one because it was because a poem was written about it. But that's the sort of thing that happened all the time. It was kind of funny reading Wellington's comments about his cavalry commanders is downright funny at times, because they never follow orders properly. The only cavalry officer that he trusted, if I recall correctly, was, I think, Thomas Hill, who eventually ended up, or maybe Hill might have been one of his generals that he trusted. But anyhow, if there were two things that Wellington didn't trust, it was the Spanish. He absolutely refused to make any strategic plans that involved the Spanish because they were so unreliable. He did trust the Portuguese, however. And he just was always despaired over the state of his cavalry. The one thing the British cavalry did really well was fight rearguard actions and protect retreats. But they reliably, regularly got too excited and ended up throwing away whatever advantage they had won on the battlefield. There's kind of a funny incident where they had a successful attack. They actually captured 17 pieces of French artillery, which was like treasure for Wellington. But instead of stopping, they rode 7 miles further, ran up into the wall, a walled city, and then got chased back and ended up losing all 17 of the cavalry pieces that they'd captured. And Wellington was furious because he'd specifically told them, go across the river, drive off the French cavalry and the artillery, and don't go any further. They actually went 7 miles further and lost everything. And of course, they took some casualties and stuff too, which they couldn't really afford. Anyhow, if you know anything about the history of cavalry units, and how they're used, the way that Faramir's charge is depicted is just, it's so utterly stupid that it's difficult to believe. Sam Freeman sends another super chat. Thank you, Sam. It says Game of Thrones did this repeatedly, was asked to leave the room for yelling at the TV. Oh yeah, Game of Thrones was much worse. I mean, we could do probably a month and a half worth of dark streams just criticizing specific military scenes. You know what Hollywood loves to do is they love to like do a circle around things, like a perfect circle in a small compressed group. And apparently you're supposed to know that, you know, this means that they're surrounded. You know, we have to actually physically show you this. It's just ridiculous. What about the European knights during the Crusades? Well, you know, the charge of the Templars at the Horns of Hatton is probably what you're thinking of. But, you know, there's like 100 years of war there. So, you know, one fatal mistake. So let's go on to the next one, and I think it'll be interesting to see if you can pick out what the issue is here, and then we'll discuss it.
They had no warning. They were unarmed. Now the wild men are moving through the Westfold, burning as they go. Rick Cotton Tree.
Where is Mama?
This is but a taste of the terror that Saruman will unleash. All the more potent for he is driven mad by fear of Sauron. Ride out and meet him head on. Draw him away from your women and children. You must fight.
You have 2,000 good men riding north as we speak. Aemir is loyal to you. His men will return and fight for their king.
They will be 300 leagues from here by now. Aemir cannot help us. I know what it is you want of me, but I will not bring further death to my people. I will not risk open war.
Open war is upon you, whether you would risk it or not.
When last I looked, Theoden, not Aragorn, was king of Rohan.
Then what is the king's decision?
By order of the king, the city must empty. We make for the refuge of Helms Deep. Do not burden yourself with treasures. Take only what provisions you need.
Helms Deep. They flee to the mountains when they should stand and fight. Who will defend them if not their king?
He is only doing what he thinks is best for his people. Helm's Deep has saved them in the past.
There is no way out of that ravine. Theoden is walking into a trap. He thinks he's leading it to safety.
So, did you catch it? Now, you have to have seen the movie to have understood what the fundamental problem was. Now, I'll have to go back and look at the books. In fact, at some point in time, I think it might be interesting to do a small series. Maybe Fencing Bear and I can do something on her Forge of Tolkien channel, talking about the military aspects of the actual book itself, because I'm not sure the conversation went precisely that way in the book. I haven't checked. This is just something I thought about tonight. Anyhow, who spotted the problem? Who spotted the fundamental problem with the way that that scene was presented? I'll give you a hint. Who is presented as being correct there? Who do they show as being correct, and who do they show as being incorrect? What's the portrayal? Reprobus says, is it Gandalf catching up to the Rohirrim? No. Although it is worthwhile that we know from Gandalf's comment that took 5 days for him to go there, to go find Eomer and get him back. Colin Cut says they were ridiculously outnumbered. Why wouldn't they have retreated to the most secure location? That's getting there. No, it has nothing to do with Eowyn. All right. Avalanche says, Aragorn is kingly and correct. King Theoden is cowardly. Avalanche is absolutely correct. Right? They portray retreating to the fortress as bad and open field war as good. That's correct. But what would have happened? Remember, they only had a small number of knights. They had so few knights that a single squadron of warg riders killed a significant number of them. You know, we don't know exactly how many of the warg riders are supposed to have killed, but the Eowyn says so few when they get back. Well, and then, now that, of course, that's from the movie. So the warg riders don't exist in the books in this section. But what does exist is Saruman's massive army, which neither Gandalf nor Aragorn are prepared for. If Theoden had done what Gandalf and Aragorn advised and simply ridden out, I mean, he talks about Eomer's 2,000 men. So he's not talking about just riding out with the forces that he's got. He's talking about riding out with the forces that he's got, finding Eomer's 2,000 men, and then coming back and engaging them in the open. So what he's ultimately talking about is about 2,200 cavalry versus 10,000 infantry armed with pikes, as Inquisitor Bear says. In other words, Rohan would have been defeated very badly, probably not wiped out because the cavalry would have been able to disengage. But they probably would have taken, I would estimate based on, I mean, frankly, I don't think that they would have even fought. They would have, in the book, there were 2,000 defenders of Helm's Deep. Right. So, but remember, they didn't have the Elvish reinforcements in the book, but they did arm the old men and the children. So let's figure that the old men and the children are probably 1/4 of the total defenders. So we're looking at roughly 1,500 or so, because they wouldn't have armed the kids and the young men to go out. So somewhere around 1,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. It says in the book there were 2,000 defenders of Helm's Deep. Then Gandalf shows up in the morning with 4,000 more infantry. So Eomer had infantry with him then in that. That's interesting. Okay. But even so, if Eomer is missing, if he's out missing with infantry, then it takes even longer to try to find them, which means that if the women and children weren't evacuated from, the Orlingos, then while the army is marching around trying to find each other and then find Saruman's army, the people the women and children are wiped out. So Helm's Deep was absolutely the correct place to go. It doesn't matter that Helm's Deep is a trap from which they can't retreat, because the women and the children can't retreat anyhow. Says the movie doesn't portray that. They over-exaggerate how outnumbered they were, which makes it even worse. Precisely. Now, what Theoden did was the right thing regardless. And I don't, in the movie, I don't know, or in the book, I don't recall if in the book, Eomer was not exiled in the book. That's true. But the point is that, and I don't even know if Gandalf and Aragorn were attempting to convince Theoden otherwise. But the point, we're talking about the movie here, and I just find it very ironic that whole scene is written to portray Theoden as being incorrect and maybe a little bit cowardly. They really wanted to underline what happens, and the reason that these things happen is that the director is attempting to make a point. And the point that he really wanted to underline was that great exchange where he says, I don't want to risk open war. And then Aragorn says, open war is upon you, whether you want to risk it or not. That's a great line. And the movie director, Peter Jackson's instincts are correct in that he wants to make the most of that line. That's the whole scene is fundamentally about that line. That's what it's all building up to. And the problem is that the writers and the director don't know anything about how military situations evolve and take place. Yeah, Inquisitor Bear confirms it. Aragorn didn't advise a stupid field battle against Isengard in the book. Yeah, I found that very difficult to believe that he did. Even with the numbers that the book suggested, which is 2,000 defenders of Helm's Deep plus 4,000 infantry. And you figure with the Rohan, at least half of them are probably 4,000 more infantry. So anyhow, they've got at least 1,000 cavalry. But generally speaking, even if you're going to win, because you've got superior troops but half the numbers, and that is doable. Some very good generals have done that. However, you are going to take significant casualties, particularly if you're engaging them, if you're going out to meet them. The reason that Wellington was such a great general, the reason he was the greatest general of all time, in my opinion, is that he was always very careful to never give battle except in a physical position that gave him the advantage. And, he was underrated for a long time because, Napoleon kind of had some contempt for him, saying that, oh, well, he's just good on the defense. And yet, later, after the Spanish part of the war, he proved that he could go on the offense too. It's just that when he was in a position where he couldn't afford to lose a single battle, he was very careful not to do so. Caesar certainly won when he was outnumbered by Pompey. Yeah, absolutely. So it's not like it would have been impossible for Rohan to win, but it would have absolutely devastated them. The number of casualties they probably would have taken would have been, too serious for them to have been able to provide much aid to Gondor. So, don't even get me started on charging elephants with horses. That was, yeah, but like I said, I'll put together a list at some point, and then I'll get in touch with Fencing Bear, and then we can see about doing a more detailed critique, a more comprehensive critique of the military aspects of Lord of the Rings, both the books and the movie. Now, one thing that I think we have to say about the movies, because we've been criticizing them a lot, but one thing I think that we have to say about the movies is that the abomination produced by Amazon, known as the Rings of Power, I think illustrate how fortunate we were that the Lord of the Rings trilogy was as good as it was, because even Peter Jackson proved it to be excessively susceptible to the destructive element, which he proved by ruining The Hobbit. I watched the first Hobbit movie and didn't watch either of them. I haven't watched any of the Rings of Power, nor will I. Yeah, and obviously this was before the blackwashing. No doubt the next Lord of the Rings will have, a black Arwen, probably an Asian Boromir, and who knows what else. In the book, there's no mention of 10,000 super orcs with pike formations. No, of course not. I mean, the Tolkien didn't really define the Uruk-hai very much, although I always had the impression that there was like a platoon or two of them, not an entire army. Colin Cutt says, it was the mother of all abominations. The Hobbit was a masterpiece compared to the Rings of Power. That's just frightening. I mean, I'm not surprised, but frightening. Paper Eating Bear says, 2 of my siblings enjoyed rings. I'm doubting my mother's virtue at this point. I think you have no choice. You should probably inform her that next Mother's Day. Yeah, Lord of the Rings movies have problems, but they were made by people who clearly like the books. That's true. I think even the 2 women who improved the dialogue, and by improved the dialogue, I mean, made a mockery of themselves, because, if you're writing lines of dialogue that are going to appear next to Tolkien's, you damn well better bring your A game, because otherwise you're just going to look silly. Why do they always talk about power? Do they think they can manifest it by breathing on it? Yes. These are people that that base everything on the power of words. They're literally they literally believe in word spells, and for good reason. Look at what simply calling people racist has accomplished for them. Word spells destroyed the United States. So you can understand why they believe so wholeheartedly in it. It's literal word magic. Blitzkrieg Bear says they just speak words into reality instead of taking action. Correct. They're practicing a form of magic. Name it, claim it is the heretical Christian form. The secular form is Scott Adams. Visualize your reality. Write it down. Write it down 10 times a day and your subconscious will believe it. It's all the same magic. It's all the same using your will to, manifesting your will into reality. So, Inquisitor Bear says, most of the Helm's Deep attack was regular orcs and wildmen. Yeah, that's why I meant. The Uruk-hai were like, the equivalent of special forces, more or less. Special forces are used for small, specific missions. Not they don't fight stand up against regular army. Non-zero chances. Hobbit trilogy also had the disadvantage of being rushed. Jackson was brought in to direct at the very last minute and struggled to keep up. Well, I think the biggest problem is they tried to turn it into 3 movies. I mean, it's not that big a movie. Have you seen the newly bound Bible for the British coronation? No, I haven't seen it. I have no thoughts on it. I saw maybe 5 minutes of the coronation. So, Gimli's treatment in Lord of the Rings bothered me. Yeah, he was turned into it was the script writers. It was Jackson's wife and her friend. They decided that he's a dwarf, so we need to make him the comic figure. What in Hobbit turned you off? It just wasn't the story. I didn't feel like it. They were trying to. They're trying to connect it to Lord of the Rings and connect it to some of the other stuff, and just all the extraneous stuff. I just had no interest in. I saw the Ralph Backus Hobbit, and I really liked it when I was a kid. And I just didn't. I wasn't like offended by it the way that I'm offended by the Rings of Power. We watched it and we're like, okay. It was boring. So, Elf and Hobbit, yeah, I mean that Elf and Hobbit romance, that's just ridiculous. Absolutely absurd. Absolutely absurd. Yeah, nothing says romance like a dwarf making dick jokes to an elf princess. Oh, that's the early stages of the abomination. Anyhow, like I said, I've only seen the one Hobbit movie. I forgot it nearly as soon as I saw it. I could barely tell you anything about it. It was just of zero interest to me. In fact, I don't think I even saw more than half of it because I think I actually, while we were watching it, I think I actually just walked out and started reading a book at one point. So, a movie is bad when like it's still on and you're just like doing something else. So, but one thing that I will say about the Lord of the Rings movie is that I thought that Liv Tyler was better as Arwen than my initial impression. I didn't like the way they tried to make her a little bit warrior princess at the ford, but other than that, she was a little bit better. Colin Cutt says, I'd love to see a Throne of the Bones film series, but the thought of Hollywood bastardizing it is too much. Yeah, I know what you mean. I think what we'll do is we'll just wait until AI improves, and then we'll see what we can do there. So, but anyhow, speaking of that, I should actually get back to work on A Sea of Skulls. So, thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you found it of interest, and we'll do more of this sometime soon. I'm Vox Day, and this is The Dark Stream.